Hello and welcome to Money Control. Today we are talking to Mr. Pushpesh Pant, who's a food historian, and he's absolutely full of stories about excellent food, and we can't wait to dig in. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be on the show.
Tell us about your book. It's called Lazzatnama, which is a very interesting title. Why does deliciousness need a book of its own?
I think is the Nama part explains this. Lazzat is something which everybody can taste. You can taste flavors of food. And the title is a gift from the Rupa, the publishers, who always wanted, the publishers wanted the stories about food to be told along with the recipes. So Nama is the chronicle of Lazzat, which is foods and flavors, delicious morsels. So Lazzatnama is a complete package which talks to you about recipes, talks to you about their domain, the geographical indicators, but at the same time takes you backstage about the legends, folklore, some real, some marketing hype, but all in all a very flavorful offering.
Delicious Morsels is a fantastic descriptor for a lot of your writing. You often sort of talk about places and people through food.
The book ranges all across from north in Kashmir to south in Kerala, from east, some selections from northeastern states also, Bengal, Odisha, to west to Maharashtra, Gujarat, Deccan, coastline. I think, we have tried to include at least one representative recipe, a signature dish from each part of the country. Now, some parts in the country obviously have enjoyed a reputation of being a mecca for the diners or gourmets. You have Awadh, for instance. You have Hyderabad, for instance. You have Delhi and Bhopal. You have Rampur. You have Banaras for vegetarians, Jaipur for vegetarians. You have two typically different streams of cooking in Kashmir, the Pandit Vazwan and the Muslim Vazwan. Kerala is a small state, but it has so many streams. It is Nadar, it is Mopla, it is Nambudri, it is Syrian Christian, it is Mopla. You have interesting food traveling all across the country. So I think that it's been a very difficult task. I think I realized late that I had bitten more than I could chew. But I'm very thankful to my publishers who sort of were patient and gently guided me that I will have to leave out some things to keep the book of reasonable size and of use to the reader. So that's one part of the thing. The other part is that, yes, you said something about traveling, meeting people, knowing. I think, what happens is when food travels, like language of a speaker traveling in different parts and settling there, it changes. It's like the Mumbaiya Hindi, the Mawali Ghati phrases come there. Or you have the Bengali rounding off everything very sweet, and whether even they are in exile in Lucknow or Allahabad or somewhere. So I think food is the best introduction to a community's identity, its preserved heritage, which they desperately try to preserve because it's part of their identity. It is also in a younger generation who has not stayed in the regions where their parents were born or grew up. They have gone to boarding schools, they have gone to professional schools, medical engineering, they have gone to preparatory schools, coaching centers like Kota. And these people, when they come home, don't spend enough time to get to know their own cuisines. Now, what happens is, when we get back to Lazzatnama, we realize that the younger generation has a great urge to search for its roots. So this search for roots is something which encouraged me and inspired me to do this book.
That sounds excellent. Can you share some of the food stories that were, really hard to sort of put together for you for this book?
Actually, to be honest, nothing was very hard to put because people were very helpful and cooperative. I remember a great chef from Lucknow called Muhammad Farooq, who once told me something which is, truth, stark truth, but truth. He says all these stories about food, Guruji, he used to call me Guruji, very kind of him, and he would say, ये रईसों के चोचले हैं, गरीबों की रोटियां हैं. The story is created about a food to make it sound more exotic, make it aspirational, and at the same time, the person who cooks can keep selling his ware. Now, the two examples which he gave are fantastic. One is the kakuri kebab, which is the world famous kakuri kebab, which is melt in the mouth, delicate sikh, which is done not in a tandoor but in sigdi. And there are several stories. One says that there was a debauched Nawab who had lost his teeth due to his excesses, culinary and sexual, and he could not masticate properly. So his bawarchi made for him a kebab which he could enjoy, and thus the kakori was born. Another story says that the Nawab Sahib of Kakori wanted to curry favor with the British officers. So when the Lat Sahib or the Naib Lat, not the Lat Sahib, but the Naib Lat, the Lieutenant Governor at Lucknow came visiting him, he got a pate-like preparation done for him, and thus was Kakori kebab born. But when I accompanied Muhammad Farooq to Kakori, the township, sleepy, dusty township near Lucknow, I realized that the story was something very different. It was truly what Farooq was leading up to. There is an old dargah of a Sufi saint, and from generations, uh, elderly pilgrims have been coming to do ziyarat at this dargah. And they, of course, had lost their teeth, not because of debauchery, not because they were Europeans, could not masticate Indian food with a bite, but they were old people who needed some comfort food kind of thing. And thus was the Kakuri kebab created for these pilgrims in the Sufis dargah, which they enjoyed tremendously. That is one story which I thought was fantastically well explored. Thanks to Muhammad Farooq, I enjoyed doing that.
Excellent. There are some things where you sort of bring in different parts of India in a very cohesive sort of way. Just to give you an example, there is this chapter on stuffed vegetable dishes. You have churan ke karele from Hyderabad, dam ki bhindi from Lucknow, bacon ka launch from Banaras, and sambaria from Gujarat, which I thought was a very interesting way of looking at food, not just in terms of what the end product can be categorized as, but also the cooking technique of it. So can you talk us through a little bit of how you sort of organize
Yes,
the
I
book?
think, because what happens is I am a very lusty meat eater. That I have always thought that what do vegetarians enjoy most? So how do they find a delicacy which is worth talking? I mean, of course, there are the cliches like kathal ki biryani, kache kele ke kebab, but what about the everyday fare which they eat? And somehow or other, we tend to overlook the plebeian vegetables which are everyday staple for people. Now, interestingly, take for instance, we started with bhindi. So if you have churan ke karele, you also have churan ki bhindi somewhere else because it is a stuffed vegetable. You slit the okra or the lady's finger and you fill it up, but the spicing changes. The churan ke karele has a spicing which is not lend that does not lend itself to immediate adaptation in a bhindi. But if you have a dam ki bhindi in Lucknow, it also is stuffed with spices, slightly different. Then if you are a Delhi wala and eat the tawe ki sabziyan in Delhi, you would see that everything is there. There is a karela, there is a bengan, there is a bhindi, there is an aloo, there is arbi. And what happens is that all these are vegetables which you use every day in your house, but they are appearing here in an avatar which is slightly more exotic. So it is stuff. Now, stuffing a bhindi is not very difficult. Packing a bagan is not very difficult. Karela is not everybody's cup of tea, coffee, or whatever you call it, but it also, some people like it. Some people like it bitter, value it for its bitterness, which is supposed to be therapeutic, but some like to pack it with filling, which takes away the bitterness. Now, if you come back to the origin of the vegetables which are filled up and packed, we go back to the coming of Armenians into India after political persecution in Armenia 500 years back. And what they did, they brought with them something called dolomantes, which became dolma in Lucknow. Karele ke dolme, tinde ke dolme, tomato ke dolme, which is a vegetable packed with a tasty filling. So you have this whole which you can conjure up that how an international culinary stream influence came into our vegetables. Interesting thing about vegetables is many vegetables which we take for granted as Swadeshi born in this country are the part of the Colombian exchange, like the tomatoes, like the potatoes. So you have these sabzis. Now, I mean, tomato was once called Bilaiti Begun, in Bengal. So you have interesting things, but then there are sabzis which are totally Indian, like a pumpkin, like a loki, like a bitter ash god, like a, and you could have these rendered in not necessarily in capsicum in a sambaria in the Gujarati way, but you also have these rendered into mimicking a meat dish like the Kashmiri kaddu ka rogan josh or dam ki loki. So you have different spicing, different cooking techniques, and people can very easily do that. You go to another section in the book, which is section not on vegetables but on musallams. A musallam is a dish which is intact and whole. So everybody talks about murg musallam. And there is a wild story about how there is a camel musallam which has a bakra inside it, and the bakra has a murg inside it, and the murg has an anda inside it. And when you cut through the anda, you get a small dried fruit, etc. And this is all packed in a bed of biryani. But if you go to the vegetarian musallams, you would see that in Awadhi kitchen, there is a brilliant Loki Laziz musallam, which is served in gravy, with a bed of very rich gravy. Or you even have a band gobi musallam. You have a pool gobi musallam. So these musallam dishes are not talked about very often. But when you eat them, you suddenly realize that these are as good as a meaty musallam, a machli musallam or a murg musallam or a ran musallam. So I think both the musallam section and the vegetable section gave me great satisfaction to work on.
Excellent. I was going to ask you about the gobi musallam because I thought it was very interesting. I've
Gobi
always thought of
musallam has two variations. Gobi musallam has two variations. You can do it with cauliflower and you can do it with the band gobi. And both are different in texture and taste and appearance, you know. South Indian porridge with lots of, or stir fries of the Gujarati variety. But this one is steamed and this one is packed with the masala. And it is very, very nice actually. I owe it to my mother and my sister who introduced me to the recipe. I think they had got it from a Khan Sama who was very gifted in Rampur Riyasat and who wanted to do it to please his vegetarian guests. So I think it was a great dish.
Excellent. So I introduced you in the earlier section as a food historian. How do you sort of see yourself? Because there's also a bit of, you know, food diplomacy. There's a bit of international relations. You also talk about stories of how food traveled, who brought it where. There's also this element of, you know, like you talk about the royals. There's also the plebeian element of, you know, how people actually ate on the ground. How do you sort of describe what your you know, area of expertise here
I
is?
don't know if I can call myself a food historian because the moment you use the word historian, you impart it with a gravitas which I lack. I don't have the discipline, I don't have the academic rigor to systematically follow, footnote things. I mean, there are people who are doing it. I have great respect for a gentleman named Dr. Kurush Dalal, who's a professor of anthropology in Bombay University, and he does this brilliantly. I don't think that most people who claim to be historians of food are historians of food. They just are describing food and buying without critically examining all stories which come to them about food and string them together and say this is like, you know, you say the pulao came to India, or so many Persian dishes like biryani came to India with Mughal Badshah. A very nice author, Salma Hussain, whom I respect very greatly, says so. But come to think of it, did the Mughals come to India as Badshahs? Poor Babar was given a title of Badshah in Samarkand, but Samarkand was a piddly little principality, no Badshahiyat involved there, and he was chased out of his family inheritance by his uncles, and he ran and came to India not as a Badshah, but as an exile. Did not live long to become an emperor. His successors became emperors in India. So no imperial dish came with Mughals from Persia or anywhere else. They became emperors in India. The second myth is, I like to call it again and again, I have a theory that the myth of Mughaliya, tyranny of tandoor, and the curse of curry is the blight of Indian food history. The moment you say Mughaliya food, what is Mughaliya food? Humayun was chased out of his throne by Sher Shah Shuri and Afghan Ruhilla. Akbar inherited the throne at the age of 13, shifted capital from Delhi after his encounters with Himu Bakal and to Agra. His son Jahangir, he was a very frugal eater. He was a Sufi-like character, Akbar himself. His food was not Mughaliya. He was vegetarian for 3 days in a month, 3 days in a week, and had khichdi twice very often. His son Jahangir drank himself to death, was of course influenced by his Persian wife Noor Jahan, but not known to have created food. Now, Shah Jahan spent most of his time building stuff and producing children. I mean, his wife Mumtaz Mahal died giving birth to his 14th child. And the poor man spent time and he was made a prisoner by his son. So where is the Mughaliya food? And his son Aurangzeb was a puritanical Orthodox Spartan Muslim who only loved khichdi. In one of his letters, he writes to his cousin son, please send me the bawarchi who cooked for me such nice khichdi. The son did not oblige. He says, send at least his assistant. We do not know if he did that. But this khichdi, which Salma Hussain mentions as laziza, is the only Mughal dish which seems to have exotica and elements which are, shall we say, imperial. It is not the sick man's khichdi. It is not the child's or old man's khichdi. It is a delicacy. But the point is, the short point is, what we today call Mughaliya food is really post-Mughaliya food. Some Mughal emperors who were living on the pensions of the British after the British had taken over control of Delhi in the first decade of the 19th century, 1803, General Lake and Anglo-Indians had taken over the Metcalfes, the Octor Looney, Fraser, and people of that kind. They ran away from Delhi and took shelter in Awadh. When they came back, they had imbibed some tastes of Lucknow. And after 1857, when Delhi was devastated, most cooks went away from Delhi to safer pastures and havens like Rampur to Patiala to nearby places where the British could not uh, hound them. The British were hounding the Muslims because they had rallied round Bahadur Shah Zafar. The Hindus had been loyal to the British. Some of their Muslim properties had been bought over by them. So I think when these people returned in the first decade of the 20th century, the myth of the Mughal cooking was created. Everybody was claiming that he was a Shah Jahan's royal Bawarchi and so on, including Karim, whose historical documentation is that he started by selling aloo gosht and roti on a pushcart. But then you invent a past, a legacy, which is imperial. It suited the British perfectly because they were claiming to be inheritors to the mantle of the Mughal emperor. उनका इकबाल इसीलिए बुलंद था. So they supported the myth कि इनका खाना हमारा खाना है, दिल्ली का खाना मुगलिया खाना है. But the food which really evolved beautifully, and everybody traces Mughal influence into it, is khana in Hyderabad, khana in Bhopal, khana in Rampur, and the khana in Lucknow continued. Now, all this is the Mughal Muslim food. Now, if you talk in terms of uh, Kashmiri food, it predates, it goes back to the days of Sikandar Chicken and the first lot of Persians coming and settling down as carpet weavers, as woodworkers, as cooks in the valley of Kashmir. They owe nothing to Mughals. Similarly, if you talk in terms of the vegetarian cooking traditions, you have food in Banaras and food in Jaipur and food in Jodhpur and food in Udaipur, which has nothing to do with Mughals. Jaipur has some influence because they had matrimonial alliances with the Delhi. Take a case like southern India, where the Mughals did not have any influence at all. I mean, even only poor Aurangzeb extended the frontiers. Otherwise, they stopped at this Deccan area, Aurangabad, Daulatabad. That was the limit they had reached. But if you come to, for instance, that area, you would see that the Arabs had come to southern India much before the advent of Islam and brought halwas and their biryanis and their pulaus. So everything is not Mughal. I'm not saying that everything is Swadeshi, but I'm saying that the Arabs came to India before the advent of Islam. So Arab influence is there, Abyssinian Habshi influence is there. The coastal areas had influence from north, south, east, west, from Turkey and Persia and Awadh. So fine. It is as much Andhra, Telangana as maybe Madras presidency days, as much as Marathwada, Maharashtra, which if you take care of this, the Nizam's domain, Hyderabad, it touched upon north, south, east, west, below Narmada, beautifully. And all food influences are there.
You have a fantastic story about Pulao in the book. Can you tell us about where it came from and what is the, I don't want to call it a tiff, but what is the comparison between Yakhni Pulao and Biryani?
Yakhni Pulao is incomparable. I mean, I'm a person who's biased in favor of Yakhni Pulao. I think Yakhni is flavorful meat stock, which the long grains of rice imbibe when they are cooked in it. And meat is cooked separately, and when they are layered and put on dum, you have an exquisite dish. Biryani, to my mind, is ostentatious, is like a novo-rich trying to display all its riches. जो कुछ हमारे पास है, हमने कान में हीरे भी पहन लिए, नाक में मूंगा तो नहीं, रूबी डाल दिए, गले में पर्ल्स डाल दिए, हमने उसमें केसर डाल दिया. We have got insist on cooking it in basmati, so poor basmati's natural aroma is gone, and you almost try to impress people by saying कि हमारी artistry कितनी थी. हमने कच्चे गोश्त की बिरयानी पकाई थी, जो 9/10 गोश्त पका था, 9/10 चावल पका था. We layered it and cooked it at the same time, applying heat from bottom and from the top. So all that is fine, but I don't want to be told how much effort has gone into it. As they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If you go to an old book, Abdul Halim Sharar's Guzishta Lucknow, the last phase of the Oriental culture, he makes it very clear. This author was writing in the first decade of 20th century, and he had lived in the court of Aziz Ali Shah in Matia Burj in Calcutta. He was born after the 1857 Gadar, but he was aware of the memories of devastated Delhi in terms of food. एंड ही सेज कि लखनऊ में कोई भी आदमी बिरयानी को नहीं खाता है, वो यखनी पुलाव खाते हैं. एंड दे से दैट बिरयानी इज समथिंग लाइक अ मलगोबा व्हिच इज अ mindless melange of different ingredients. So I have not changed my opinion. Biryani is easier to sell because there is a great marketing hype about biryani. There's a Hyderabadi kache gosht ki biryani, dam ki biryani, bori biryani, mopla biryani, telichiri biryani, mutton cherry biryani. Then you have a mean biryani. Then you have a chamin biryani. Then you have a Calcutta biryani. You have a no, of course, Lucknow also is not to be left behind. They have Idris Mian ki biryani, which is supposed to be very good. Then you have Delhi ki biryani, then you have Rampur ki biryani. Now you, of course, have a Muradabadi biryani, the new latest kid on the block, which is available both in vegetarian and non-vegetarian versions. I mean, I've been living in Delhi for past 6 decades and more, and my hometown is in Nainital, Mukteshwar. So when we drove past, there was no such thing as a Muradabadi biryani, even in Muradabad. It is like the Kavariyas traveling recently in past 2 decades. The Muradabadi biryani is of very recent origin. And Muradabad, incidentally, was not a riyasat. Muradabad was directly ruled by the British. It was famous for its brassware, not for its biryani, no way. So I think, food has interesting things. No, but to answer your question more succinctly, pulao certainly came to India from Central Asia, where it was called a pilaf. But pilaf is something which is a very simple dish. But what we eat in this country is an aromatic delicacy which has evolved, which you might say is the height of evolution of a pulao. And you have references to pulao in ancient Sanskrit texts like Bhava Prakash Nigantu, which say pulao is rice cooked with condiments, meats, and vegetables. So we knew pulao in 4th century, 5th century AD. It was an Indian pulao, not a Persian pulao. Now, if you have a mopla biryani, it is closer to the Arab pulao than anything else. And I mean, the whole thing applies even to vegetarian pulaus. It is not that the vegetarian pulaus were created to please the vegetarians who were rich, like Jain merchants, etc. If you see that there is a fantastic pulao called Rose Bil Laws Wa Bil Tamar, which translates roughly as rice without condiments and without tamar, which is tamarind. Now, Arabs call tamarind the date of India. That's how it got its name. But this pulao was created for Maulana Rumi, a great Sufi saint, who had forsaken meat. But his murids, his disciples, were very worried that his health would suffer. So they wanted to give him a nutritious pulao or a meal. So they created a one-dish pulao, which was made with chickpeas for protein, supplemented for fiber with dates, dried apricots, dried figs, nuts of all kinds, and made creamy with melted butter poured on top of boiled rice. Now, this is a fantastic pulao, which is called Kabuli pulao. So I would much rather play around with pulaos than worry about with ostentatious biryanis, which everybody and his dog likes to eat or to feed his guests. You get a day, you have some kebab, and you don't have to exert it all in the kitchen. And nobody has the patience to cook biryani in these hard non-democratic times, non-feudal times, where slaves are not there or joint families are broken up to partake the labor. So biryani is a much hyped dish. I don't think that I'm very impressed by that.
You've mentioned elsewhere that your food journey sort of began at home, where your mother was an excellent cook, and that you perhaps didn't realize that you were getting to eat foods from so many different parts of the country, because to you it was just home food. How do you sort of keep that variation and that interest in food going now? What does your food journey look like on a day-to-day basis?
You see, it was not only food. I mean, I'm very glad you asked me this question. Everything began with my mother and father. Like all childs begin with their mother and father playing around in the bed, and then they are born. So the point is, my father was a doctor. My mother was a polyglot. She was born in Kathiawad in Gujarat. She talked to her mother in Kathiawadi, Hamdo Hamdo, the typical dialect of Saurashtra. She studied in Shantiniketan with Tagore when he was alive, and she was one of his favorite pupils. She studied Hindi, she studied Chinese, she studied Tibetan. She also spent time when her father was a minister, the only Hindu minister in Rampur. So she knew a little Urdu, and she knew Bengali, Assamia, Odia, Marathi, Gujarati. So, what she gifted us was not only the food from different places, she also made a gift of language. So, to answer your question honestly and clearly, it comes to me effortlessly. I still read a little Gujarati. I listen to Bengali programs. I try to listen to some Marathi talks as well. I enjoy food from all parts of the country, and I think there is a continuity in my life in terms of my being a multilingual person and a person who's omnivorous. And my father's contribution was no less important because he was not only a doctor who wanted to know how food affected you, tasir kya hai, what should you eat in what season, what time, what age. He also had studied medicine in Lucknow. So he was a connoisseur of Thumri, Dadra, Ghazal, Pan, and Kathak, and so on. So he tried to correlate food with festivities, food with seasons, food with personal preferences. Nobody forced us to eat something. Nobody forced us to like something. But when I grew up, I did my first master's in history, then I did law, then I did PhD in international relations, and everything seemed to follow the natural course. I was doing a PhD in Southeast Asian studies, and the maritime spice route came into existence. When I was doing history, I was reading about the historic Silk Road, and the Silk Road and the spice route met in India. And then when I was trying to get my pocket money writing freelance articles, I wrote things for magazines, newspapers, television. They took me to food stories, to interesting backstories about food, and I think it's not been compartmentalized in my case at all.
Excellent. So now do you travel a lot for food, or does food travel to you?
The food doesn't travel to anyone. You have to travel for food. I mean, you may claim that good food you can cook at home. My son is a brilliant cook. He insists that he doesn't use a pressure cooker if he can help it. He doesn't use a mixie if he can help it. He uses a selbatta and he uses slow cooking, and he does a very good approximation of Afghan, Pak, Northwest frontier cooking. But if you really want to taste something absolutely exotic, uh, the Muhammad has to travel to mountain.
So how often do you travel in the month then? Is half a
Not
month?
not as much as I would like. I'm touching 80 and I like to travel comfortably, but I still manage to travel at least 2 to 3 times in a month to short distances which we can drive in our own car. At times, I manage to wangle a business class or a premium economy ticket from the organizers to a lit fest.
I have a slightly meta question as well. A lot of your books, along with having the food stories, also have recipes in them. Now, given that food bloggers have been around for a really long time in India, where do you sort of see the place of recipe books? At a time when you almost
The
everything is online.
recipe recipe books will have a very long shelf life. That's why I keep writing like scribble, 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 Mr. Gibbon, as Victoria told Gibbon. Food bloggers, to my mind, are the latest generation of freedom fighters. So I do think that the printed book recipe has a much longer shelf life.
Excellent. I also wanted to ask you your favorite khichdi recipe, which is a question that is, you know,
My favorite khichdi recipe is a simple one. It's an arhar ki dal ki khichdi, which I like to, 1:1 ratio of dal and chawal, which I like to eat with a very watery gravy of haldi pani gosht or haldi pani mach. This recipe was shared by a dear friend who's no more, Atul Rai, a Premchand's grandson. He used to cook it. His mother was a Shia Muslim from Banaras, and he was, of course, of caste stock from Allahabad. So meat eating came naturally. But this was one of the most brilliant dishes for these sweltering summers. You have arar ki khichdi, khili khili, not a mishmash, not a porridge-like thing which Al-Baruni was talking about, but this khichdi, the arar ki dal, not moong ki dal, not mash ki dal, not masoor ki dal, and also eaten with a thin gravy. I think that's my comfort food.
excellent. Thank you so much for your time, sir. This has been so informative. And the book is absolutely lovely. I thought the food stories were really lovely. And like you said, it's punctuated in a way, to my mind, the organization of it was fantastic because You talk about rice dishes, you talk about breads, and then you go into these different techniques of cooking vegetables and meats. And the way that you sort of mix it all together is exactly how we sort of eat around India. And that sounds, to my mind, it's quite a perfect meal in itself. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.